Welcome to our Bird's Eye View panel today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Bunwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. As we gather to hear from our panel about birds in art and science, I would like to acknowledge the First Peoples of Australia as the first scientists, artists and historians in this country. Our session today is part of the Melbourne Rare Book Week program, and I'm thrilled that we've been able to participate again this year, bringing a museum flavour to the program. This is the 10th Melbourne Rare Book Week, and this year there are 45 free events running across Melbourne from the 18th to the 27th of July. I believe many of them are booked out, so I do hope you got in early. We will be taking questions via Slido today. You'll see the information displayed just underneath here, and please submit your questions that way using the hashtag birdseye. I'm going to hand over now to our moderator, John Keane. John is an art historian, writer and curator. He was art advisor at Papunya Artists 1977 to 79, inaugural exhibition coordinator at Tandanya, the National Aboriginal Cultural Institute in 1989 to 92, exhibition coordinator at Fremantle Arts Centre 1993 to 96, and a producer here at Museums Victoria from 1996 to 2010. He was the Thomas Ramsay Science and Humanities Fellow at Museums Victoria in 2004, and more recently in 2020 was awarded a PhD in art history from the University of Melbourne. John has published extensively on First Nations art and the representation of nature in Australian museums. His publications include The Art of Science, Remarkable Natural History Illustrations from Museums Victoria, which feature some of our wonderful rare books, and Dot Circle Frame, The Making of Papunya Art. Please join me in welcoming John and welcoming our panel today.
Thanks, Hayley. What an amazing turnout. Is it raining outside? I'm thrilled to be moderating this session on ornithological art, particularly as we aim to bring images of birds, some of which were made in distant ports, into our moment centuries after their first creation. The extraordinary collection of rare books in the Museum Victoria collection are not passive objects. There are thousands, many thousands of illustrations, some on vellum, and the majority on beautiful handcrafted paper. They show birds from all continents and numerous islands, and the context of their creation demands our interrogation. These images can be analysed to trace changes in technology and that enabled artists, printmakers to edge their way closer to the colours and shapes of living animals they sought to represent. These are historical documents. The majority of these images were created as an offshoot of the radical expansion of trade in the 18th and 19th century. And if we can go to the Sieber image, yeah. Albertus Sieber was a Dutch pharmacist whose premises were near the wharves of Amsterdam, and he was therefore in an ideal position to get his hands on medical materials brought from the Dutch East Indies and other locales. Sieber also collected natural curiosities brought by seamen to be sold to the inquisitive and the acquisitive collectors of Europe. Sieber's image of the lesser bird of paradise is based on a skin specimen, presumably purchased from indigenous hunters by traders in what is now Papua New Guinea. And they were carried by those traders in small vessels into what is now Indonesia. Who knows how many hands these specimens went through before they were acquired by Sieber and illustrated by an unknown artist and sold to customers who then commissioned their own colourists to complete the works. Given its journey, the fidelity of this image is extraordinary. Many of the images held in other editions of Sieber are more fancifully coloured. by people who had no knowledge of the animals that they were illustrating. Turning to the next image, it appears that the illustrator was in the same room as the white cockatoo he was drawing, for the bird is sentient and makes eye contact with us still. By the 1730s, cockatoos from the islands to Australia's north were already popular cage birds in Holland. The next slide, I think. As well as producing some of the finest artisans of the era, the French bird illustrators were products of empire. And there is some irony, given the turbulence in the Napoleonic era in which they worked, that the natural illustrators and engravers worked with such precision. It was the European Enlightenment, and I'm always astounded by the acuity of the French engravers. It's unsurpassed to this day. Francois Levian's Histoire naturelle de Paraquets is a masterpiece of colour engraving. As good as many of the French illustrators were, most of their images were from dead specimens or tame birds perched on a stick. This Kangaroo Island emu is a fascinating example of an engraving that was made from a living bird, probably in France. Go to the next image. That was all about to change. The backwoodsman John James Audubon changed all of that. He would go hunting in the morning and then pin out his prey on a gridded up frame in the dynamic poses that he'd observed in life. He'd hunt in the morning, draw in the afternoon. His compositions shrieked of the environments from which he collected his specimens. And Audubon's image of the ivory-billed woodpecker is the closest we can now come to this magnificent and tragically extinct species. John James Audubon produced many hand-coloured etchings at a scale of 1:1. And in a macabre way, his volumes are the pinnacle of ornithological illustration. In contrast, Henry Constantine Richter was a much less dynamic figure. He was a jobbing artist who produced numerous images for John Gould. It feels like many of his images are from imported dead specimens, but it feels like this image of a toucan is drawn from a living bird, perhaps a captive from Regent's Park Zoo in London. John Gould was inspired by Edward Lear's monograph on parrots. This image of an eagle owl, it's coming up, was created by the writer and illustrator of the children's book, The Owl and the Pussycat, and has that extraordinary animation that makes it one of the greatest images ever, I believe, of birds. John Gould used a revolutionary printing technology, lithography, to produce an unlimited number of copies. He was hard on his artists and colourists. He was a businessman and a perfect product of the Industrial Revolution through which he lived. That brings us to the colonies, Victoria in particular, where the history of bird illustration came to be used for public good. And that seems like a very ideal place to end this brief introduction into bird illustration and rare books and introduce our wonderful speakers. They're all very accomplished speakers and demand introductions, so excuse me if I'm talking so much and not quite getting to the speakers first. Dr. Karen Rowe is the curator of birds in the Museum Victoria's Research Institute. She's a museum-based research ecologist specialising in using acoustic methods to document the diversity and distribution of animals, particularly birds, across landscapes. This work has included long-term monitoring of endangered species and addressing the impact of bushfires on bird communities. Her work actively focuses on using acoustic technologies to bring together land managers, landcare groups, and community participants towards improved management and conservation outcomes. going from a science curator to artist, the other side, the joint side really of our discussion. Gracia Harvey and Louise Jennison have been collaborating very closely since 1999, making artist books, zines, collages, stories, prints and drawings. Besotted still, it appears with paper for its adaptable, foldable, cuttable, concealable, revealing nature, using an armoury of play, the poetic and the familiar too, with the intention of luring you into their artists' books and zines. And Gracia and Louise have made a special edition for today that we'll be showing you a little later. Their most recent commission was for the National Gallery of Victoria for Melbourne Now, for which they created a pocket of restored landscape habitat, especially for the grey-headed flying fox, collaged with 100 pieces from the NGV collection. Now Beck and I have got a long history, so I should say that she is a dynamic curator with 18 years experience in the collections. She collaborates across this multidisciplinary organisation, a critical role, I believe, and she keeps historical practice energised and relevant. She strives to engage to address our colonial legacy, and that's something I think we should touch on a little bit later, and is an advocate for the promotion of women in the museum sector, and she's on many committees and boards. What a distinguished panel. Karen, let's go first to you. If I could ask a few questions, and then I think you've been prompted to use Slido. It's a radical technology for bringing your questions to the top. But first we've got a few minutes of these questions. And to make sure that we stay on time, I'll just set an egg timer. So if this goes off, throw whatever you've got in your hand at me, because we've got to finish before that 13-14 minutes is up. Karen, in the museum, curatorial expertise is derived from many disparate sources. Can you describe how ornithological specimens, historic field notes, and in particular the rare book collection complement and inform your research?
That's great. It's a really complicated question, but it's a really good one. One of the best things about being a curator is that we have the opportunity to combine the historical knowledge of the collections, the artwork, which gives us information about the context, the sort of historical understanding of birds, and then we apply more modern techniques to how we move our understanding into the future and how we can actually understand what will happen to animals in the future. And I found that the rare book collection and a lot of Beck's deep knowledge of the history of the museum and history of museums in general really helps that holistic picture of what has shaped the birds that we study, particularly in Victoria, and how we can apply that knowledge to future work. So a lot of my work is on sounds, and we don't have great historical collections of sounds, but we can infer what historical landscapes would have sounded like based on historical notes, based on artist impressions, all kinds of those things. And that's how we can understand where animals were, where they are, and where they're going. And so it combines a lot of different disciplines. It's very challenging. It's always a new day in the office, I guess you would say. But it also allows us to leave the benchmarks over time. So what our jobs really are as curators is to understand, preserve, protect, and build collections and the knowledge around that. And I find that I do a lot of work with community groups because there is a really long-held appreciative knowledge of nature, and we want to do our best to capture that and make it realized not only for sharing with future generations, but to help us understand how animals exist in the environment and what they mean to people as well. So there may be a roundabout way to answer your question, but yeah, that's sort of how I see my role at the museum.
That's a very contemporary way, I think, of interacting with all of those media. Another question. Ornithological illustrations reflect the history and context of their production. We can see just how they've changed over the centuries by examining the pages of the few rare books that are currently on display in the study centre adjacent to us. While it's easy to be impressed by the technical brilliance of these tantalising images, can they also be misleading? How sceptical should we be about bird illustrations from a previous era?
That's a really good question. And it actually comes up with taxidermy as well. So there are examples of what we might call bad taxidermy, but it often has to do with not understanding the context of the animal in its environment. And it's definitely knowing how animals are when you see them in the wild. And photographs are a great example of a realistic perception of what an animal looks like. But historically, when you brought up the excellent point that a lot of people were illustrating birds they'd never seen before, they probably never would see, working from specimens that are biased based on the way they're prepared. And so preparation methods have changed over time, and that really can bias how we portray those animals. And it's really great to see the historical ones, because you see how even the insectivorous birds, the perception of what, like things like the robin, so here's a flame robin here, looks very much like what it would have looked like in the wild. But you can see things like magpies, the shapes of the bills are a little bit off and the coloration is a little bit off. And that's really just a reflection of what resources were available to the artists at the time. But I think that as we move towards more media that have a way to see exactly what that animal is doing in its environment is actually a great opportunity, because it allows us to kind of explore new areas, like, fantastical environments they might exist in, or new ways to apply coloration, and the way that animals behave changes the potential of art as well, I think, in that case. So it's just another sort of learning experience of how people's perceptions have changed and how that manifests itself in artwork. I think that's a really cool way to interact with the collection, as well as to how it affects what you see when you go out in the wild.
I guess the aspect of time that you capture in your acoustic work with birds just brings a whole other level of dynamism, and as true a vision of bird behaviour as any illustrator could create. Yeah,
and I feel like, because I think people have a natural connection to birds because of music, and so we often adapt. We've talked about how bird song often ends up as part of music, and a lot of songbirds reflect motifs that are reiterated in music, and I think that that's maybe one reason why we connect so well with them. But the sound of an environment puts you in context and in place, and it's sort of like smell memory. Like you smell something and it brings back memories. And I think for me, sounds of landscapes brings back memories. And so, I'm not from Australia. You can't tell from my accent, but and so for me, a landscape of a childhood for me would be Eastern U.S. And so the landscape here sounds very different. But if I hear that landscape somewhere else, it brings back all these emotional connections and understanding of why things sound different here for very different reasons, and sort of understanding the ecology of why that's the case, I think is a really powerful tool to get people to engage with nature.
Yeah, it's birdsong is such a beautiful experience, incomparable. Karen, bringing your work into the bright light of day, can you also tell us about your engagement with the wider community, and in particular, what are the benefits that accrue from citizen science?
A lot. I can just say that, a lot. So I've had the privilege of working with a lot of different groups of people from different backgrounds, and being new to this country. I've only been here for 13 years. I'm always learning something new from the people around me. The picture you see up on the board there is a project we've just wrapped up with the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network. One of the ways that their group is interested in monitoring wildlife is recovery from the 2019-2020 bushfires. And one of the tools that we develop in our work at Museums Victoria is how we can record sounds of landscapes and be able to understand which birds are calling. And so when you have a fire go through, a lot of the birds have been removed from that habitat. But as they start to come back, it's interesting to see which species come first, which species never come back. And we can do that through sound. So we help them buy song recorders that are programmable. We put them out in the environment and they record sounds. And then we help them provide them with the tools to analyze the data. So it's not that they go collect the data and then we analyze it and we give it back to them. It's more that we're training them to use their deep-seated, long-standing knowledge of their local area, use a new tool, and then be able to address whatever questions that they're interested in doing. And we learn much more from them, I think, than we teach them in the long run.
It's beautiful reciprocity.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll start this egg timer again, so we keep space for your questions later on. Louise and Gracia, got some questions about your particular practice, your very unusual practice. You combine entrancing images from the past and that speak of the environmental multi-crisis that we now face. That's my interpretation of one aspect of your work. Can you tell us about your practice, especially as it pertains to the sourcing and recombinations of images of birds from rare books?
Yeah, for sure. So we've been collaborating for almost 5 years or so. And we make mainly works on paper, sometimes enormous installations, a lot of artist books, and then down to little zines. Yeah, we're always working with mainly kind of collage, but like sometimes we draw it, sometimes we do projects like I saw Anne's out there, so there's like our APW amazing project we did where we went to Paris and we looked at collections, and then we came back and made these collages and drew the collages as etchings and lithographs and made a suite called Glass Eye Suite based on museum specimens. But then we've also done projects like our brand new artist book, maybe the Restoring Corridors, which is a small edition but a huge book that once comes out of its hand-painted box is 3 metres by a metre and has 12 panels that are interchangeable, like reversible, both sides. One side's bright and it was about biodiversity and has all these amazingly complicated shapes that can only exist because the other one exists. And then the other side has all this negative space. And that's what we have done to our environment. We've broken biodiversity up. We've encroached on space and everything. So that's sort of like 2 projects out of what we do, and then maybe from
I think with the Restoring Corridors work, so on one side we do have where things are fragmented, and it's looking at things like as simple as how does a frog who is here get across to a habitat over the other side, and also, but there are plenty of birds as well on the biodiverse side, and also a whole lot of a bird buffet of a whole heap of insects, because there's also a lot of insects in our work. And in another book that we've made, Bilateral Symmetry, we're looking at how insects communicate and things like tree hoppers communicating through vibrational messages that they send. And mainly, I guess, all of our work is looking, or we are looking through our work at portals into like another way of seeing or another way of being, or just that we are not the only species, that we're not always the only species, and always that we seem to, as humans, be up the top. And it just, sort of, I guess, opening a window, like as Rosalind Crisp always describes about her dance. It's opening a window for people to come through if they wish, and so we're opening like a door or a window, and you can leap through and perhaps see something from another person's perspective, another species' perspective, or a bird's perspective, or insect.
So it appears that space is critical to your choice of media. Can you give us an idea of how you convey your meaning, or extend upon the way you're conveying meaning? You've already explained that. Perhaps by illustrating some of the smallest works you do, the zines, and the most, the cheapest probably. And at the other end of the scale, look at the opportunities that come of working in a kind of immersive three-dimensional space, such as the room that you recently wallpapered at National Gallery of Victoria.
With the work that we made that you saw earlier, which was the remaking of things at the NGV, so that was a 36 metres by 5 metre high, so it was an entire room, and in that it was, as you mentioned, about the grey-headed flying fox, because we are also wildlife carers who specifically look after grey-headed flying fox. And in that you can see there the beautiful reed warbler, and there's a lot of John Lewins in there. There was the three-toed kingfisher, which is now the azure kingfisher, the warty-faced, which is now, was it the regent honeyeater? So we had all of the life in there that is supported under the umbrella of the care of a flying fox. And in that we tried to make a landscape that was, so we had like perfume bottles for little eucalypt flowers, and using other things that to make an environment, but mainly so that you had the feel of an environment. So it was a big embrace that you could, be in there. Yeah.
And we had in the middle of the room a collage activity, so kind of like a zine. People could sit down and restore their own habitat for the flying foxes. So they could cut out all little components, and they had two beautiful, their State Library Victoria illustrations of the flying foxes, and everything else was from the NGV. So tons of things that weren't of the forest, and then some things like the wildflowers of Melbourne that were would be wildflowers that you found. And in making that was the most glorious opportunity to interact with the public and like the people viewing our work. We'd go in and sit with them and stuff. And there was a 24-minute sound and light loop as part of the piece, which was like a lot about sound. So being in the forest is like what you smell and what you hear, and birds and wildlife, more often than not, you don't see, but you perceive through sound and scats and things like that. So we couldn't put scats down in the NGV, but we could do sound. So we had like all these recordings, these amazing recordings of different colonies.
We had a sea eagle at one point that flew down the river, and then that, because we love that sense of like when you'd hear that, and then all of the other birds that would just, you could hear that sort of flitter of panic and scarpering. So we tried to include that, and we had, off topic of not birds, but we had the contact calls of a mum calling to her pup. But we did have so there was all of the birds. There was the frogs in the at 3 a.m. and different sounds. So different.
So that was so it wasn't a zine per se, but it was a collage activity that was kind of like a zine. And then we had little drawing activities and stuff, which was just gave people also a chance to be in the forest for longer, because part of what's glorious about going out and being in these environments is that you get to sort of let go. And if the quieter you are and the more time you spend letting them teach you, the more you learn. So we wanted to make the space so people could stay there as long as possible. And then we make zines. We've been making zines throughout our whole practice, our whole career, like as a way of sharing and interacting with as many people as possible. And as also kind of it's been a fun activity for us, because some projects like will take like a year or 2 years of making intensively, and then whereas a zine we can make in a week or whatever. So that's like a really fun little bit of balance for us in our work.
So in addition to your work in the rare books and the images that come from that source, I believe that you've said that you're very keenly involved in the rehabilitation of wounded and orphaned wildlife. Can you explain something about your commitment to animal welfare and how it's integral to your artistic practice?
Yeah, well, I guess we see them as one and the same. So something like our artwork is a way of giving back and raising awareness or calling people's attention to something, and the same that our work that we do as Tiny But Wild, which is our wildlife shelter, is a way of us also being able to give back. So we began as foster carers with the RSPCA looking after cats, which then sort of grew into being foster carers for grey-headed flying fox, and then it sort of sprung into, well, why not become our own shelter? So our shelter, Tiny But Wild, is out of our own little house. So we have a home-based studio and a home-based shelter, and they rub along quite well together. As you can see in this slide, this was a beautiful barn owl that was at Flemington Racecourse. It's just so exquisite it's such a privilege being up close to an animal and getting to learn them in a different way, to like a two-dimensional sense, and just being able to see those beautiful eyes. And it reminded me that we've written about before about the Annie Dillard, when she spoke about the moment of connection with a weasel, that she was sitting there and then this weasel appeared from underneath a rose bush and looked at her and she looked at them, and there was just that moment of connection before she thought, oh gosh, I should record this, or oh, isn't this amazing? It was just this sort of portal into another way of seeing and being. And there was this moment with that owl when they looked just right at me, and there was just sort of, you saw like a whole universe, or this whole other way of how it must be if you were, a bird. And then obviously then it goes. It's just a second, but it's just a real privilege to be able to be close to them, and to be able, like we mentioned, like we got to see the ear openings and how they're not symmetrical, so that they've got that. So they can, with the disc of their face, so they can, locate prey with such precision, and just, trying, like we've got our large gloves on there, but, trying to, pop your hands through the plumage, and then there's the little small body. But it just gives you this whole other way of being able to understand, and it's all about learning, learn from another species.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, because we've always worked has become more and more about nature, but it kind of was early on as well. It's just our journey of learning stuff too, I guess. But there was a point when we made the Hemline of Smoke series, a series of 3 artist books, and that was when the mega fires were happening. And at that point, we were doing, for the previous couple of years before that, one thing a weekend, like going to a citizen science thing, or a planting day, or I don't know, Merry Creek clean-up waterway sort of day. So many local amazing activities going on. And then the fires happened, and then we realised, no, hang on, every second of every day, everything we do has to be now about nature. And just that penny dropped of we're not separate from it, we are all intrinsically linked. So everything, we decided to change everything, and just threw ourselves into learning about the flying foxes. And sometimes, we just think about that you just need to fall in love with a species, like any species, and then figure out what you can learn as much as possible, from institutions like this incredible place. There's so much we can learn, and then once you learn about them, fight like hell for them. Yeah.
Beautiful. Now, our last speaker, historian, who's going to bring that special perspective that historians can bring to experience in the world. Rebecca, we first met very happily and bonded over a rich cache of images in the archive just above us, in fact. Can you describe your initial engagement with the museum's first employee, William Blandowski, and perhaps let us know why Mr. B is such an intriguing and mercurial character?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting sitting here with you 20 years later. Reflecting on those early days, I was thinking while you were speaking that there's so many synergies, but in the reverse, between you and Audubon. I was thinking of Audubon. He was so connected to his practice, but the difference was he was shooting in the morning and he was illustrating in the afternoon. But it's still the connection a lived experience, a daily practice, and yours is so far removed from that, but has a similar rhythm. And I have to say, from the early days of working at the museum to now, it feels like the difference between I was Audubon and now I'm you guys. My practice has changed so much. Blandowski was the museum's first curator. And when I first started working for John, it was John who introduced me to Blandowski. Thank you. Blandowski was, to discover him when I did was really important in my work, because he stood out and remains a standout as far as his work. It was so different to other scientists at the time. He was a minor Prussian. He was an extraordinary character. I'm not sure if you're all aware of him, but he wore a cape, an extraordinary cape, and he had this wild look about him. And he was wild, really. He was quite the adventurer, and I think he saw himself as the adventurer. And his field work, and he did practice true field work. He was out across Victoria from the beginning of the museum, 1854. He was constantly bringing that knowledge back to the museum and sharing it with the people of Victoria. And so I suppose that's exactly where my practice was as a history curator when I came here. The who, what, when, where of the men of science, because that's what we had from the early period of the museum, the early periods of science. And I was obsessed with someone like Blandowski because he was so different to so many other men that were scientists in museums in the 19th century. He seemed more playful and open to experience, open to other forms of knowledge, particularly Aboriginal knowledge. In an institution like this, that was not the case. The next director of the museum completely ignored even the existence of Aboriginal people. He felt it had nothing to do with... It held no value. They held no value. So unfortunate. But Blandowski worked collaboratively with Aboriginal people everywhere that he went. And the more I look into his work, even this year I'm learning more things in Berlin, finding examples that he had really rich encounters even here in Naarm. His collaborators, his Aboriginal collaborators, were all over Victoria, actually all over South Australia as well. So, I suppose it was that was kind of the beginning of me starting to recognise that there was a different way of looking at the history of collections and the history of science, that there was perhaps another narrative to tell.
So having established the depth of the archive and his particular sensitivities and interests that may be partly cultural, maybe partly personal, well, definitely both, can you describe how your research has taken you into a more fulsome engagement with people and country?
Yeah, sure. It's not just the research, it was working with colleagues. This place is such a joy to work because you work with extraordinary people across so many disciplines with so many different perspectives. And not long after working with John, John went off to do other exciting things. I'd always called him the professor, but then he went and made it legit. He made it legit. I became curator of the history of collections, and on top of that I was given the job of field historian for the scientists. And so rather than just sitting in the archive with the brown stuff, I got to go out in the world, and I would prepare reports for the science teams, kind of a forward report before they would land in an area in the field, and research the kind of the human impacts on the landscape that they were about to enter into, industry, population, the way parks particularly had been managed interventions over time. And I went from doing that to being in the field with them. In fact, I went on Karen's first big field trip when she arrived, and we were helicoptering all over Wilson's Prom. I think he got dropped into Hidden Valley from a helicopter on that trip. Paradise Valley, yeah. You know, they were truly some of the most magical moments I've had as a history curator. Usually we are in the archive, I have to say. But being on country, in those first few field trips, I started to realise the histories I was preparing were influenced heavily by the history of the institution. I was telling it from that perspective. And then I'd get on the ground and I was really aware, this was 19 years ago, 18 years ago, some of those trips, I was realising I don't understand the country I'm standing on, that I'm talking about, writing about. And I started meeting traditional owners and understanding, even though I was at the museum where we had, and at the time it was called an Indigenous Cultures Department, we now have a First Peoples Department staffed by Aboriginal staff. But at the time we had a lot of anthropologists, and again, my understanding of the world was shaped by that as well. So I started doing these reports and realising I needed to learn more. And as I learnt more, I also had this wonderful experience of working with Kimberly Moulton, who was one of the first new curators of the First Peoples team. And she helped me to start to read the archive differently, read the landscape differently, in the same way that John helped me read the landscape from perhaps the animal's perspective, which was just so important in my work. Kim helped me to start looking at history, the record, to look for the absences in the record, and to hear really loudly how scientists were describing environments and how that language was not theirs. The knowledge had not been theirs, they were just not acknowledging it in the record. And yeah, over time, that led me to work directly and collaborate directly with First Peoples collaborators on projects that now seek to retell all of these scientific histories with the knowledge now that all of these collectors had interactions with Aboriginal people and were learning the majority of the things that they knew about habitat, landscape and species from Aboriginal collaborators. And right now I'm working on the most extraordinary project in Berlin. I think you've seen some photos there where one of Blandowski's biggest expeditions along the Murray, they took illustrations from one end of the Murray to the other of particular species, and at every stop they would work with different groups, different language groups, and they would record a language name for those species on the illustrations. And so you end up with kind of sketchy, spotty, but language lists. And that language left Australia with Blandowski in the 1850s, and they have been trapped in this archive in Berlin ever since. And after many years of work and getting funding from the Lost Art Foundation in Berlin, the photos you see up here is the trip that's finally happened. They've just been back a month or so of this photo. The lady here in the blue is Glenda Nichols. She's a master weaver, waddy yoda yoda woman, and she went to relearn so she has deep knowledge herself, cultural knowledge, but there are practices hidden within these collections and archives which she can take back to revitalise culture. And you can see there's a photo of her, one of the slides, she's looking at duck nets that were collected by Blandowski. To collect ducks, they would string them up between massive trees over the river, and then they would herd the ducks down the waterway, and they would get caught in these massive nets. And the nets, you can see here, the nets made it to Berlin. They've been there the whole time, and Glenda was examining the knots, and then really quickly in the far right image you can see we went to a craft shop and bought some twine, and she was relearning these knots to take home and share that knowledge back here. So there you go.
Fantastic, Beck. It's been an amazing journey to be a witness to, and it's gone from tiny little isolated moments of interest at different institutions into being a kind of international consortia of research, and with your work with First Nations people with a solid base in country. It's a beautiful project.
Thank you. It's been such a privilege to be part of, and I think a big part of the project has also been about teaching those Berlin institutions respectful ways of engaging with the source communities that their collections come from. They often have had no knowledge and no contact. And so what we're doing is building lifelong relationships for those language groups with those institutions, because Glenda and Brendan aren't the last to travel.
Now it's time. Thanks, Beck. Thanks to all the speakers. But now we've got some time for your questions via Slido. So the first question is by an appropriately anonymous. That person may well have been working for SEBA as an illustrator 300 years ago. Does natural history illustration still have a place in the modern day, or has technology like cameras replaced it? Beck, could you answer that?
Absolutely. We have a scientific art collection here that predates this museum, and we're continually adding to it. And the thing that I hear all the time from our scientists across all the disciplines, whilst there's more and more reliance on digital forms, Karen's recording bird sound, and we have Ken photographing his little
Native bees.
No, the bee sacs, the tiny little things blown up as massive photographs. So whilst there's a lot of digital work being done, line drawings are still integral to so much of the work that scientists do, and I try and encourage them to lodge as much of it as we can in the scientific art collection.
I'll add to that actually, because for anyone who's a naturalist, we rely a lot on field guides, but the best field guides are not photo guides, they're drawing guides, because they're able to highlight the traits and the characteristics that are important for distinguishing among different animals. And so I still feel there's a very, very strong need to continually use illustrations as a way to help people understand wildlife in context. And it also gives you a perception of someone's interpretation of wildlife as well. And I think all of those things are still very important to keep as we move forward.
Karen, this is another one for you. It's the top of the list right now. Have you ever discovered that a bird captured by an illustrator just doesn't exist?
Oh.
I can help you with that question if you like.
Yeah, that's probably good. I mean, most of my work doesn't actually work alongside of illustrations. So my knowledge of historical illustrations, I always rely on people like Beck and artists to help me understand that. But there are situations, so I can give you an example. I do a lot of work in Indonesia. We're doing a lot of biodiversity inventories with the Indonesian Institute of Science, because there's a lot of places still to explore there, and there's a lot of knowledge still to be gained about the biodiversity and the value that biodiversity plays in protecting forests. And some of those field guides are wrong, actually. So the animals that we come across in the field sometimes don't match the field descriptions. And so there's still a lot to be learned, and it takes time to describe it in a scientific way, to consult with local people, to find out their information about how we do work with local people a lot, and they help us understand the presence of the animals, where they're found, where to find them, what they look like. and all of those sort of things. So there are still instances where we need to revise our knowledge because we still lack information. There are so many species that we've never even described in science, and we probably never will. There's going to be a lot that go extinct before we even describe them. So there's plenty of work out there still to be done in that space.
There's also, like, it was the thing to do in the 19th century to just make stuff up. And they did it all the time. Your favourite hydra,
Oh, yeah.
the many-headed,
Yeah.
made-up beast.
I thought that was an allegory for the museum's own organisational principles. I don't work for the museum anymore, so I can say that.
I can tell. But yeah, there was such an incentive to publish new species from the New World that a lot of unscrupulous gentlemen, mainly in England, made up these fabulous beasts and would sort of publish them. And the public imagination was so ready for, and was already discovering things like the platypus, let's face it. They were like, yeah, sure, a hydra exists. If a platypus is real, then why not a hydra? So, yeah, there's a history of that.
And just when Hayley and I looked at some bird books a few weeks ago in preparation for this session, in the Levian's book of parrots, we came across what looked like a hybrid of a eastern rosella and another rosella, maybe the result of the kind of artefact of two birds being in a cage together. And a previous curator, Les Christidis, pointed out the number of birds of paradise who just get so excited by the other's plumage and they cross species and produce young that are exceptional. So there's those sorts of birds that exist in the world.
It's evolution in action, as you might say. There are plenty of examples of hybrid species that exist, and it also is species that are undergoing separation, and so there's a real biological and evolutionary phenomena, and so it's interesting that sometimes that's captured without realizing that we won't understand what's going on until many, many, many years later when we have the advent of DNA and PCR and all of those genomic techniques that we now know.
So to the artists, what would you do if you came across one of those species? Would they make their way into your forests, or would your practice demand that you exclude them?
We include everything. We're collage artists, so everything goes in. Yeah.
Okay.
we put a mixture in. As long as, the only thing about our work is that we're trying to talk about that the solutions are here already. And so if we can use, sometimes like it's a Banksia or something like that, or the wildflowers, or things that are actually part of nature, or that we use the brush strokes from another painting, and then we have little bits of etchings, and so things that sort of become abstracted because we've used little bits of them and blown them up big, or it's completely changed, but it's making the feel of those places, the feel of that those ecosystems, isn't it? And like with this is restoring corridors, so this is part of the biodiverse side. But we wanted to make a work in that case, and then also with our NGV piece as well, where the audience participated, because we're all the solution. Where we can all make the solutions happen. So we made work that's active, that people have to step up and join in. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, it can be include any bird. All of them.
All of them. I think this question's to you, Beck. You've talked a lot about contemporary practice, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on contemporary collecting. And this could also be specimens, but in particular, could you bring it back to rare books and the acquisition of them for the collection?
Ooh. I wrestled for a while in my early years here, particularly when I started going out in the field with the scientists, because historically There are so many moments where we have captured in the collection an extinct species, which is, it's wonderful that we have the record. We need these records. But there are a number of instances where the last example was captured alive in a period where we knew it was extremely threatened. And so I went out in the field with the scientists, and under extraordinary ethical guidance, certification, and I must say, I've watched the discussions that happen. This is not done lightly. And the kinds of things that I'm describing historically don't happen anymore at all. There's a lot of ear tagging and skin tagging that happens rather than taking vouchered specimens, which is what we call when the scientists collect a specimen in the collection. And I struggled with that. I really did. I loved being out in the field and documenting scientific practice, following my colleagues around and being able to be the one that was documenting them in the moment rather than reading about them 170 years later. But I struggled. But over time, in the same way that my practice has evolved in the last 19, 20 years, I have watched the scientific practice within this organisation change. Karen's a perfect example of that. The citizen science that she's doing, the restoration work post bushfires. Karen's husband is the senior curator of mammals here. Karen and Kevin worked together post bushfires, working on habitat and species, saving species and habitat. And so the kind of worries that I had for a while as a historian going out into the field with scientists, and I was worried that it was going to be like that. I've watched it evolve to a point where the museum's job now, to a historian, maybe Karen should speak to this, but it looks to me as a historian, our job now is to secure the future, not just document the past.
Thanks, Beck. That's a wonderful way. The thing about Slido is that so many people have put in fantastic questions, and like other question sessions, our time runs out. Yep. I believe we're due to finish about now. Is that correct? Yep. Got the thumbs up. So I've got one little task left to do. We can all pick these up. This is a wonderful little zine built specially for today, made, constructed, illustrated, documented, and by Grace here and Louise.
Which does answer your question earlier about would we use something else? And I've just realised, yes, we have.
That's what these are.
We have made a kookaburra that becomes a zebra finch, and you can make your own one. So I have to eat humble pie. We have already done that. Yeah.
That's genetically so wrong. They're not even parrots.
Yeah.
So this wonderful zine is available for purchase for how much?
$7.
$7. Yep. Beautiful in a frame. Lovely to play with. Yeah.
You just have to come up and see the artists afterwards. They've got their little square thing that takes credit card things and phones. And also, just a little history fact, some of the Goulds in this collages come from we think it's one of the oldest books. I'm going to call it, Hayley, the oldest book in our collection, purchased by Landowski in the first year of the museum, 1854.
And taken into the field and annotated in the field. So it's a very unique thing and a much more kind of mucked up it's got some River Murray essence in it, unlike a lot of rare books, which have got dead white males, amongst other people.
A lot of them.
So thanks very much for the panel. But firstly, thanks very much for your questions and your great attention throughout. It's been a real joy to be here to to hear what the panellists have to say and to share a moment with Rare Books and how they can take us into the contemporary world. So can you thank the panellists, please? Thanks very much to the production staff too, who've been wonderful and made this all really happy. And I believe the session is going to go online. Well, do you ever get the feeling you're being watched?